Okay, yeah. So today, I'm going to skip going over my background because I've done this so many times before, and I'm just going to launch into this a little bit. So the Ombudsman report, the Ombuds Office of Family and Children in Washington, every year or every other year puts out a report on child maltreatment fatalities. And they put out two reports a year. They put out an annual report, which speaks to kind of larger issues in the system, often issues related to foster care and other issues as well. And then they put out a separate report most every year, not every year, but at least every 2 years for the last at least decade on child maltreatment fatalities. And so they just released their 2024 report within the last week. At least I received it within the last week, and it has so it concerns child maltreatment fatalities in Washington State that the Ombudsman's office was informed about by DCYF, that is the Child Welfare Agency, in 2023. So it's a calendar year report. It's not a fiscal year report. It's from January 1st of 2023 to the end of December of 2023. So now the advantage of this, I just want to say a couple of things about the methodology and also about the importance of it, because this report has been coming out using pretty much the same methodology, the same way of classifying maltreatment fatalities for at least a decade, probably longer than that. So for that reason, it's possible to look at trend lines. So it's not just, the importance of it is not just that it tells you what happened last year in 2023, but it shows trend lines over a decade. And those trend lines are, I'm going to talk about part of that today, and those trend lines themselves are of great interest, right? So, and I just want to say by, sort of a side thing that there are probably not more than half a dozen states in the country that have a report of this type. And the other states, the handful of other states, Texas would be one of them, Kentucky, Tennessee, a few others. Those reports in those states aren't done by ombudsman's offices. They're done, and all of the reports that come out yearly, they use somewhat different methods and ways of counting and classifying child maltreatment deaths. And so the Washington State system that the Ombuds Office uses is somewhat different than is used in other states. And that's why it's very tough to compare states for this reason. You're not really talking a lot of times about apples and apples. And, you would think you would be, because it sounds like, wow, child death, that's kind of factual. But how that's classified and how that's counted in various states is varies widely. So just a little bit about then the methodology that the Ombuds Office in this state has used over at least a decade and probably longer. So first, their sample of fatalities, or their list of fatalities, is based on notices that DCYF, or formerly Children's Administration, the child welfare system in this state, gives them information about child fatalities. They don't have any other way of getting it. So whatever they're doing in that report is a reflection of what DCYF has reported to them. And so there's always a question then about the extent to which the kind of stats that they're getting from DCYF, are they comprehensive? Are they accurate? Is DCYF, in other words, doing anything different over the years in the way that they inform the Ombuds Office? And it simply isn't clear from these reports. There's just no way of knowing this. I mean, I kind of intuitively think that DCYF has changed its practices in reporting near fatalities, which is one of the really shocking things in this report. But I don't know that for a fact, and it's not stated in the report that that is in fact the case, right? So what the Ombudsman's office does is they receive information about child fatalities in three categories. And so they have a category of total deaths. That is, total deaths on open or recently open cases, or cases that have even been referred within the 12 months prior to the child's death. So to say this again, they're talking about open cases, cases that have been open within 12 months of the child's death, and also cases where there has been a CPS report made that was screened out, an information-only report. So this is also, by the way, a difference in methodology from some other states. Some other states wouldn't include the information-only stuff at all. I mean, not an open case. You know, some of those families never seen, never investigated by the child welfare system. So that is an idiosyncrasy. I think it's a good one, but other states wouldn't even use it as a kind of example here. So for example, in the 2023 numbers, then the Ombudsman's office received information about 79 child deaths on open or recently open cases, or cases where there had been a CPS report, even a screened out report. So they use three different numbers. And so the first number is the total fatalities. And some of those fatalities could have been the result, for example, of just natural causes. A child could have died of pneumonia in the first year of life, or it could have just been a natural death for some other reason, right? And it wouldn't be classified as a child maltreatment fatality. Out of those 79 total fatalities, the Ombudsman's office report classified 49 of those as child maltreatment related in 2023. So I'm going to say this again, 49 child maltreatment fatalities. And so what the 49 number then means is cases that are classified, they include cases where there's been a substantiation, or the death is of the child is believed to have been directly due to child abuse or neglect. And in some states, that's all that they would ever report, that group of cases. In this particular state, with the Ombudsman's office, that's not true. Only about a third of the deaths are in that category. So out of the 49 deaths, 18 are viewed as either directly due to either abuse or neglect, and the other ones have what the Ombudsman's office calls child maltreatment concerns. So those would be cases, for example, where there might be an open case. There would be issues related to substance abuse and mental health issues, domestic violence. Those would be a lot of times poverty, often, so I'm going to talk about it in a minute here, severe poverty. All of those issues related to maltreatment, that's called a list of factors that might have contributed to a child's death, but was not the direct cause of it. So that's the 49 number, right? And then you have the third group. There's a group of cases where the Ombudsman's office, along with DCYF and a community groups, do an executive review. And that is, in this particular year, that's 18 out of the 49 cases. So 18 cases where they did an executive review. So if you know anything about, for example, federal stats, that is, in the child maltreatment reports that come out annually, within the next year or two, a report will come out for 2023 or 2024, and it'll probably be based on a fiscal year. So the number will be a little bit different, but it will only list the cases that were substantiated. So it won't list the federal report, the one that goes into the official NCAN statistics will list it will either be 16 cases or it will be 18 cases. It won't be 49 cases. So that's what so just as a way of sort of explaining that. Now, I like the larger number for a couple of reasons, and I'm going to say that real briefly why I do, because again, some states would only report the substantiated number, the number of cases that have been founded. That is, there was some act of abuse and neglect as determined by an investigator. And usually the reason I don't like this criteria is because for child maltreatment death in Washington and most other states, that also includes the findings of either a medical examiner or a coroner or a law enforcement agency that decides to prosecute the case. So to substantiate a case, particularly a child maltreatment fatality in Washington, it usually takes one of those three things. Well, for reasons that I'm not going to get into here today, medical examiners and coroners rarely classify an accidental death as neglect related. It's just not in there. They just don't do it much. I mean, it's not unheard of, but it's rare. So the reason I like the larger number is because it's more likely to capture the neglect-related deaths. whereas the substantiated cases a lot of times will exclude those deaths, right? So whenever you look at, child maltreatment reports on an annual basis, the ones that come out yearly and these child maltreatment 2021, 2022, et cetera, reports, that's always going to be an undercount. And it is a large undercount, in my opinion, as suggested by the difference between the 18 number and the 2023 number and the 49 total cases where either a child's death was viewed as directly due to child abuse and neglect, or there were factors pertaining to abuse and neglect that might have, quote, contributed to the child's death. That's the 49 number. And so, since I understand that might be a little bit confusing, I'm just going to stop here for a second and see if you have a comment or question about what the Ombudsman's office is actually counting. Comments or questions about that? Okay, so before I go into the sort of the overall discussion of trend lines here and so forth, I just want to say a few other quick things here. So one of the things I want to say is that in the Ombudsman report, 3 of these deaths of children occurred in foster care. 3. And they don't say why they occurred in foster care, just that they did. A 4th case occurred in a daycare center, a daycare run by a grandmother, by a relative of the child, where a child died there. So that's 4 out of the 49 cases, either in foster care or in a licensed daycare center. So that leaves 45 cases that occurred in birth family, for the most part, birth family homes. So out of those cases, then, a lot of them, small number related to abuse. So I think in this particular report, less than 1 out of 10 of child deaths were related to physical abuse. According to the report, there were 5 children who were murdered. 5 out of the 49, right? So, and one of those children was a failed reunification. So out of these deaths, 2 of these children had been in foster care and had been returned. One child, the child who was killed from physical abuse, was killed by his father 5 months after being returned to the family in a reunification. The other child was 17 years old and had been in foster care 3 years before and died of a drug overdose when he was 17. So I don't even view that as failed reunification. So, I'd say that out of those 49 cases, 1 case was a reunification case, and that was one of the 5 homicides. So this is sort of one of the lessons that you learn about looking at child maltreatment deaths, both in this state and nationally. A small percentage of them are due to physical abuse. A much larger percentage of them are due to neglect, which I'm going to talk about here in a minute here. But fully, the thing that's very surprising in this report is that 2 out of 3 of the cases are listed as undetermined. That is, neither physical abuse or neglect, but undetermined causes. Well, how in the world could that even be? I mean, so, and the report does not clearly explain that, but I'm going to sort of offer an explanation which, in my opinion, sort of probably explains it as well as it can be explained here. So medical examiners, I've already said this, coroners, law enforcement agents, officers, it's going to be very, very rare that they take either a sleep-related death, and a lot of the deaths I'm going to talk about here were from unsafe sleep, or from accidental ingestion of drugs. A lot of the deaths in here were from opioid overdoses. A lot of times those cases are not going to be classified at all as either abuse or neglect. And those are in the sort of, a lot of times those are in the undetermined category. For reasons that maybe we don't, we can, if there's an interest, we can talk about that, some other time. But that's why, so 2 out of 3 of the cases, out of these 42 out of 3 of the 49 cases, were listed as of undetermined nature. Almost about close to 30% of them were from neglect, less than 1 in 10 were from physical abuse, and I've already mentioned the low number of murders. And so again, you're talking about an agency here, just to put some perspective on it, that probably is dealing with maybe close to 50,000 kids a year, something like I'm here. I'm guessing could be somewhere in the 40 to 50,000 area, probably, that are the subject of investigations, assessments, and you're talking about 5 abuse deaths and 50,000 kids. So a lot of the cases here were either sleep related, and again, so just to explain a little the complexity or the difficulty of interpreting the report, the report gives percentages of deaths as a percentage of the total number. So that's why I had to read this over 2 or 3 times this morning trying to understand this. So about a third of the total 79 fatalities in this report were from unsafe sleep. And so for the most part, that was children sleeping with their parents or with a caregiver or with siblings, for the most part. That was 26 out of the 79 deaths, total deaths. So that's about a third of the total deaths, but of course it's going to be more of the maltreatment deaths. But the report doesn't say what percentage of the maltreatment deaths that is. And so, so I'm guessing it maybe is 40%, that's a guess, of the total child maltreatment deaths were due to unsafe sleep. And for the most part, that wasn't unsafe sleep of just kids sleeping in beds or cribs with, you know, toys or pillows or things like that. That's unsafe sleep. They were sleeping with people. You know, over 90% of the cases in which kids died of unsafe sleep-related stuff, they were sleeping with the caregiver or with the sibling. And one of the things the report says is that it says often, it doesn't say how many times, often that was because they simply didn't have space to do things differently. That is, some of those were dirt poor families. One of the children who died of unsafe sleep was sleeping with his mother with a homeless mother in a car. Sometimes whole sibling groups were sleeping on a single bed or mattress because that's all they had. So issues related to poverty very definitely play into the unsafe sleep thing. Again, according to the report here, you know, I'm not me opining. That's what the report says. And also sometimes parents, of course, sleep with kids because of their own emotional needs. So one of the problems with particularly with CPS interventions, attempts to prevent child deaths over the years, both before they ever come to the attention of a CPS agency or after they come to the attention of a CPS investigator, is that just giving parents information about safe sleep and unsafe sleep doesn't protect kids' lives. Herein lies the problem. If information would do it, we would see a big reduction in these kind of deaths. But that has not been the case either in this state or nationally, right? So out of the 29, out of the 79 total cases, then 16 of these deaths were related to accidental ingestion or drug overdose. So that's about 20% of the total number, the 79 number, but of course, probably closer to about a third of the maltreatment deaths. So what I'm guessing here to try to, I hope this isn't, you know, too mixed up so that you can't understand what I'm saying here. It seems to me that probably around, as a guesstimate, because it is me guessing, about 70 to 75% of the total child maltreatment deaths were either sleep related to unsafe sleep practices or to the accidental ingestion or drug overdoses. 70 to 75% of the total 49 cases. And I've already mentioned that 5 of the 49 cases were murders, right? So now I can just say that in a long time ago, when I worked for the Child Welfare Agency in Washington, the situation was very, very different. That it usually, for example, kids who died in neglect-related incidents, right? They usually were drownings. They usually were kids who were hit by cars or something. I mean, the lack of supervision was the major factor in those neglect-related deaths. In more recent years, and really for a very long time, it's either been the unsafe sleep practices, which if they're classified at all are classified in the neglect category, or it's the accident in recent years, it's very definitely the accidental ingestion of drugs. And again, I'm using language from the report itself. So I'm not as convinced as the Patrick Dowd is here, the Ombudsman and his staff are. I'm not as convinced that all those deaths of children in that 0 to 1 category, and there's several of those kids who died of drug overdoses, I'm not so convinced that those were all accidental ingestion of drugs. I mean, they might have been. That's what the report assumes, but again, those are babies. They're not very mobile. I guess I question that. It might be true. So before I change the subject here, before I go any further, let me stop and see if you have comments or questions.
I have one. How do they define accidental ingestion?
In the report, it isn't defined. I mean, in other words, it wasn't a parent giving a child a drug as a prescription. It wasn't sort of like a doctor said, give the child a prescription drug or something. It was most of those deaths in the accidental ingestion thing were from fentanyl. You know, those were drugs that the parents were taking. So you're talking about parents who have substance misuse issues, and a child, again, I'm assuming according to the parent, a child gets into that in an accidental way. I mean, it wasn't a deliberate kind of a thing. And a lot of those were from very, very young kids, but some of them were in the teenager group as well. So the teenager group, you get into the drug overdose thing, where some of the teenagers were finding their parents' drugs and were taking their parents' drugs on purpose, deliberately, either to get high or to, to kill, or as a way of killing themselves.
But the parents were still providing the drugs.
That's the implication. Now, the report doesn't say that, not providing the drug. The drugs were in the home. The drugs were in the vicinity of the kids, right? In other words, they weren't locked up or something like that. So, of course, the issue in recent years with how do you prevent the accidental ingestion of drugs, part of the reason that this has been such an intractable problem in CPS agencies is no one has come up with a feasible, reasonable safety plan for preventing that from happening in homes where the opioids are around. And in the last couple of years, for example, in this state and some other states, there's been discussion of, well, giving the parents a lockbox kind of thing, talking it over with the parents in an informational kind of way. And a lot of people, including me, just view that as absurd. I mean, why would anyone believe that that would ever work, right? But I'm not against trying it. I mean, because here, I guess the message that I'm trying to get across here is that the CPS folks and the other people who work with them don't seem to have an idea for what a reasonable in-home safety plan would be to prevent unsafe sleep deaths or the accidental ingestion of drug deaths. That is, there simply is a cluelessness here. And that is not saying something that is negative, particularly about our child welfare system. That is true nationally. So therein lies the problem with, if you're not going to put very young children, particularly infants, I'm going to say something about that here in just a minute, in foster care, when there's a substance abuse issue, well, what are you going to do to protect the lives of the kids? And again, lack of good ideas for those two causes of death. Now, the other major concern here that I want to say is that out of these 49 fatalities, remember the 49 fatalities, 2/3 of these were infants. 2/3 of these were in the 0 to 1 age range. So what is startling about that? From just the number itself is striking. But in most years, if you look back in most years in Washington, and if you look in the federal stats and in other states' reports of child deaths, it usually is that about 45% of child maltreatment deaths are kids in the 0 to 1 category. That is somewhat less than 50%. It's by far the most of any age group, by far. Still, it doesn't usually come, it's not quite 50% most years in the past and in other states as well and nationally. This year, the 2023 numbers in Washington, that's 67% of all the 49 deaths. So Something has changed then, presumably in regard to infants. Well, what is that something? And there is a very brief answer to that. It's the Keeping Families Together Act. What's changed? So this is what I want to say a little bit about the sort of the trend lines here. So, here I want to give you three different kind of numbers here. So I'm going to go back to 2019. Why? The first year that DCYF was fully in charge, DCYF was created by legislative action in 2016. DCYF became responsible for child welfare in Washington, I believe, on July 1st of 2018. So the first year that DCYF was responsible for managing the whole child welfare system in this state was 2019. Okay. 2019 is also the year that foster care began to go down in this state. So in 2019, there were about 9,100 kids in foster care in Washington state. As of a few days ago, there were 5,100 kids. We're now in 2024. There were about 5,100 kids in foster care in this state. So in that 5-year period of time, there has been a 44% reduction in foster care in Washington. Okay, so where has a lot of that impact happened? So the Keeping Families, so 2019, DCYF becomes responsible for child welfare. In 2019, foster care begins to go down. Now, I just want to say, I don't think those two things are much related at all, at least in the initial stages. I don't think that DCYF managers came in and immediately said that we're going to reduce the number of kids in foster care, and it instantly happened. You know, these were things that were in process before DCYF ever took over. Okay, Keeping Families Together Act passed in 2021. Okay, in 2021, there were 35 child maltreatment related deaths in Washington state, again, according to this report. In 2023, there were 49 child maltreatment related deaths. So there's about almost a 40% increase in child maltreatment fatalities from 2021 to 2023. And I do think that is related to the keeping. So why do I think that? Because in the fall of 2023, the DCYF data unit put out a report about what was the effect of the implementation of Keeping Families Together Act in the first 3 months of its implementation. That is July, August, and September. What happened? There was a 40% reduction in the placement of infants in the first 3 months of the Keeping Family, if you compare that to the first 3 months of the year before. So the Keeping Families Together Act, it's not the total number of kids in care coming down that is the concern. It's the effect on infants placements, particularly when you don't do anything else to protect those children. So it isn't just fewer kids going into foster care, it's also not doing other things to compensate for that reduction. So that's part of the issue. So that's on the fatality side. Now, the actual most shocking numbers in this report have to do with near fatalities. And this is also one of the strengths of the Ombudsman report that you don't find in other states. I can't remember a report in another state that even reports on near fatality. But the Ombudsman report in this state does, right? So just consider a couple of numbers here. Go back to 2019. 16 near fatalities as listed in the Ombudsman report in 2019. In 2023, 53 near fatalities. More than a tripling of near fatalities in 4 years. So if you go to 2021, again, Keeping Families Together Act passes. 27 near fatalities in 2021 compared to 53, so a doubling from the time of the passage of that law, right? So, and again, I've written on this subject in the past, but just to say this again, I was told by the Ombudsman's office in 2022, before the law was ever implemented, that it was already having a major effect on decision-making in many courts around the state before the law was ever implemented. So again, thinking about trend lines here, 2019, 2021, 2023, a very large increase in both fatalities and near fatalities over that 4-year period of time. And a lot of that has to do with issues related to accidental ingestion of drugs. So, so here's the other weird thing about what happened in this state. The state narrowed the grounds for child removal at a time when opioid deaths were increasing. That is, when safety threats to kids were increasing, the legislature narrowed the grounds for child removal for all age groups, not for some age groups, all age groups. And that has had a major effect again on the placement of infants here. So, so before I go any further, say anything more, let me just stop and see if you have comments or questions here before I talk about some other features of the report here.
Hey, Dee, I was on a group that was going through, I think it was the 2023, just looking at some of those critical incidences and looking through. I was really shocked, and we didn't get through all of them, but I think that the idea that it's parents or like parents malfeasance kind of doing this, or even department malfeasance when it comes to accidental opioid ingestion, it was really difficult to draw like a line, like said, bad social work behavior, or incompetent social worker behavior was kind of leading that. I think the thing that was most remarkable to that is just kind of how like the parents would like leave the kid with a caregiver, right? Like a babysitter, and then that babysitter placement had fentanyl, or like the kids got into that fentanyl. It wasn't necessarily always the parents' stash, so to speak, that was causing those accidental ingestions. And one, it was at a restaurant. They were letting the kid crawl around on the floor, and he picked up a tablet and put it in his mouth, and that was what did it. And so, and I'm just saying that anecdotally. I just don't want everybody thinking, oh my gosh, it's the parents' use of fentanyl that's causing all of these accidental pieces. And a lot of times it's who they've left the kids with, and sometimes it's who they left the kids with, or just circumstances of the environment. That was kind of shocking. So I don't want there to be like this direct conclusion that parental substance abuse is what's leading to all of this. It's just community substance abuse.
Good, an important point there. So let me see, I have a question here. Curious if there is any info on Fair to Thrive. No, there's no comments on Fair to Thrive anywhere in the report. In fact, there's no comments on any kind of other neglect-related death. There must have been some, but there's no comments on deaths from drowning or from house fires, or the kind of things that used to happen as a result of neglect. There must have been some of those kind of incidents, but it doesn't figure in the narrative of the report here. So yeah, I just don't know the answer to that.
The other thing I just want to say really quickly, I was very skeptical about those lock boxes, D. Like where they were putting, basically they give these to parents to put their stash in. They're actually working, like, because parents now have a place to kind of put all their stuff. And so I don't remember the actual stats, but I was talking to Jasmine, who was doing all the safety framework stuff. She said like there have been a significant reduction when they give those lock boxes out to parents. It's basically, it reminds them to kind of keep their stuff away from the kids. So even if the lockbox themselves aren't working, the idea that they need to keep their drugs away from kids that at least is sinking in.
Well, I'm 100% for trying it. I mean, initially when I heard about it, I thought it just sounded like a ridiculous thing because it implies some rational planning that would be going on and so forth, right? But in the absence of better ideas, I'm definitely for trying this. And if it's working, hey, great. Because of course, I mean, at some point you just got to try some stuff here. So I do want to say a few other stuff about some controversial features of the report, and the report, just some of what I'm going to say now about issues related to race and ethnicity, there's no narrative about it. There just is information. The report is conscientious in this way, and it provides information. So what's the shocking feature of this? Is that if you add up all the fatalities and near fatalities and you come up with a total number, and then you break down the number of fatalities by race and ethnicity, both Native American and Black children are about 4 times more likely to die compared to their percentage in the population. So there is a big disproportionality factor here in child maltreatment deaths, and it's a very, very large. So it's at least with Native Americans, it's between 4 to 5 to 1. So what that concretely means, so to come back to that, and again, I'm using numbers that are in the report. According to the report, 2.4% of the child population in Washington State is Native American. According to 10.8% of the critical incidents, that would include the fatalities and near fatalities or Native American children. 5% of children in Washington are Black. Somewhere close to 20% of close to 20% of the critical incidents there were of Black children there. So a very, very pronounced amount of racial disproportionality here, and particularly in the sleep and the unsafe sleep related category. Remember, something that is very definitely related to poverty, again, according to the report here. So the children who were the ratio of the reverse side, Hispanic kids that die at about, from maltreatment related stuff, at about half the rate compared to their rate in the population there. So again, according to the report, has no more information than that. So again, before I go any further, let me just stop and see if you have comments or questions here. Okay, so I guess I want to come back to the issue here and talk a little bit more about infants here. And because we're going to run out of time here, and I'm not going to be able to finish what I'm going to be able to say here. Probably we'll have a carryover discussion into next month, and I'll come back to the subject of infant safety here in the coming month, and we'll have more of a discussion about it here. But first, I want to say a few more things about this particular subject. So first, it's just an overview kind of thing, and I've said this before, maybe in some of the past trainings that I've done here for all of you, but if you look at sort of the difference between the U.S. foster care system, the U.S. child welfare system, and foster care systems in Northern Europe, and I just wrote a sounding board on this within the last month, or you look at foster care in Canada, Australia, England, and so forth, that the thing that stands out here more than any other single thing is that a lot more infants and very young kids in foster care in the United States compared to those other countries. In the high income countries, English speaking countries, well, why is that? Because they have lower rates of child poverty, they have less extreme income inequality, they have better social welfare systems, and the result of that is that their child welfare system deals with many, many fewer very, very young kids. So the foster care system that we have in this country is very much of a product, or very much affected by the larger social welfare systems in which it is nested, in which it is a part of, so to speak. So you're talking about 1 in 5 children in this country who go into foster care 0 to 1. So I want to say this again, fully 20% of kids who go into foster care in the US are 0 to 1. Probably in Northern Europe, that might be 1/10 of that, maybe. I mean, there's a huge, huge difference. So the interesting thing to me is that there are higher rates of overall foster care in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, than there are in the US. But the kids in care in those countries are generally school-aged kids. And they're kids who are in care for the most part, because of behavior problems. And sometimes there's also child maltreatment. There is a lot of the time, but a lot of times there isn't. So what there is in those other countries, there's, as a ratio, a lot more abuse compared to neglect. In the US, because of our particular social welfare system and because of child poverty issues, a lot more neglect than abuse. And particularly child poverty affects the parenting of very young kids to a greater extent than the parenting of somewhat older kids. So you end up with child welfare systems in the United States that are just heavily weighted. You talk about half of the kids in foster care are entering foster care before the age of 5 or something, before the age of 6. and 20%, 1 in 5 again. So it turns out that it matters a lot from the standpoint of a permanent planning outcome, whether an infant who enters care in the first 3 months of the child's life or enter care from the age 3 months to 12 months. So the younger a child enters care in the US, that is in the 0 to 3 month age range, the more likely they are to be adopted. A very, very high percentage of those kids who enter care in early life are going to end up in adoption. Much more likely, much higher rates of reunification for kids who enter care between the ages of 3 months and 12 months, right? So, of course, the issue then about, the idea of reducing foster care then is you have all these little kids who are very physically vulnerable in care then, and if the idea then is that we don't want to put those kids in foster care, what are we going to do as an alternative? What is going to be an alternative to care? And of course, the shocking thing about what happened in this state, and this is not DCYF's fault, this is policymakers. The Keeping Families Together Act was implemented at a time when substance abuse resources within the last 2 years had actually declined. They had not increased, they had declined. And the law was implemented in a way where additional family supports weren't put into place at the time of the implementation of that law at all. It was done because there was such a negative view of foster care and because the idea that bringing those numbers down was a good, worthy goal in and of itself, without too much concern about, well, how do we make this work in terms of child safety? But now we've, of course, had 2 years. And so, to its credit, the legislature in the last session did several things to try to correct its mistakes in 2021. And it put into effect some pilot programs, which are very praiseworthy. It increased the amount of childcare that was available. It changed sort of the standard, changed some of the language in the Keeping Families Together Act around the presence of fentanyl in the home, instructing courts to give the presence of fentanyl much greater, quote, weight and so forth. So the legislature made some adjustments, but it hasn't done nearly kind of enough. So I want to come back here to the idea that there has been a reduction of more than 4,000 children in care in 5 years. So the difference, so what's the cost of 4,000 kids in care? I mean, I wish I had, I'm going to find the answer to this because at some point I'm going to write something on this subject. Many, many millions of dollars. So the idea from my perspective is, if you want there to be less kids in foster care and you want those kids to be safe, you should take all the money from foster care savings and put it into family support services, every penny, beginning with pregnant and parenting women treatment programs. Now, the last I knew, these residential treatment programs for mothers with a substance abuse issue and babies. The last I knew, there were 3 of these programs in the state. And I may be, at this point, I may be wrong on this. There may be another, but it's not an approach to keeping kids safe that has been taken to scale. There were more of those programs. When I worked in child welfare in the 1990s and early 2000s, there were more of those programs in existence then that are in existence now, 20 years later. So we have millions of dollars of foster care savings in this state. So that money could be reinvested. We could take pregnant and parenting women residential treatment programs to scale. And that means putting them in at least in all large counties. And in all counties where there are medium to large size offices, right? Those are expensive programs, yes, but the state has saved, again, millions and millions of dollars through the reduction of foster care already. We can have crisis nurseries of the sort that exist in the Spokane area with Vanessa Behan. We actually have the money to fund those kind of programs, right? So what we need here is not just more substance abuse services. We need more safety-oriented services that are going to protect the lives of infants and toddlers, because these are the kids who are being the most endangered by current practices. And we have the money in the state has already been saved. It's already been accrued. It's not a hypothetical something. It's already happened. So in other words, there's a possibility to go back and look at a baseline spending in 2019. What did DCYF spend on foster care in 2019 when there were 9,100 kids in care? What did DCYF spend on foster care in 2023 when there were 5,000 kids in care? Whatever the difference is between those two numbers, every dollar of that amount of money should be spent on family support services, focused on the very youngest kids, focused on infants and toddlers especially. So just as sort of an idea, just to start off with here. And it's very praiseworthy that there would be 3 pilot programs initiated by the legislature in the last session. But pilot programs, typically, in my experience with child welfare, they take anywhere from 5 to 10 years to bring them to scale, if in fact they are ever brought to scale, and most of them aren't. So in other words, you have 2 years of testing, and then you have another year of writing a report, and then maybe if you have positive results, maybe there's implementation. We have kids endangered now. We need to do something now. More than has been done already. I guess that's what I'm kind of saying here. So in the short run, we need to think about particularly the safety of infants here, because those are the ones who are the most endangered in this report. And so I guess with that, I'm going to stop here and see if you have a comment or question.
Yeah, I'll just throw out there kind of one of the things that we've been seeing a lot of is that it's how the Attorney General's office is viewing 1227 that is causing a lot of, I don't think social workers know when they should be filing court intervention paperwork. And so it's this idea of in-home dependencies, right? Where we need the structure of the court oversight to kind of make sure that the parents and everybody's doing what they're, and the department for that matter, are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Those cases aren't coming in anymore, or they aren't coming in at all, because in the eyes of the Attorney General's office, there's this notion that if we don't need to place out of home, then we don't need a dependency case. And I feel like that's what's causing the unsafety aspect of this new way of looking at, and a lot of that was precipitated by 1227, granted, but I think there are ways that you can look at that 1227 is like, hey, we should be prioritizing keeping families together. How do we give the services in the home rather than taking the kid out of the home and then working with the parent? So I think there's a yes and to that question in terms of how can we use the court structure better to keep kids safe versus just leaving it all up to the department.
Yeah, so just a comment there. I worked in child welfare for 32 years in 2 states. And always, when I worked 26 years in this state, and there was always a disagreement within child welfare staff, and very well-informed people, very, very experienced people, just had different views on this particular subject. Some people, a large number of people, believe that the only time you should be using dependency actions is when you were placing kids out of the home. That was probably the majority view. I had the minority view, which I think you were stating also, Ryan, that there are times when you need to be using dependencies to support an in-home kind of approach there, particularly when you've tried unsuccessfully to work with parents in the past, when they have a history of not following up on service delivery, et cetera, right? So that controversy has always been there. The problem, of course, with using an endangerment standard with infants, so Keeping Families Together Act, it uses a child endangerment standard. I think for somewhat older kids, I think that's a reasonable kind of standard. But for infants and toddlers, it's not reasonable in my view, because if you wait till kids are in danger, it's too late. A lot of the times it's too late. The kids are too physically vulnerable there. So there needs to be a somewhat broader standard for child removal in those cases and for finding dependency there. So the other things we need is there got to be a lot more work on in-home safety planning here. So what this state lacks is what most other states lack. There's not a private agency infrastructure to support in-home safety planning, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that's a very weak part of child protection, both in this state and nationally. But now you're leaving more kids in these situations where there's obvious, at the very least, there's high risk. And so you need an in-home safety kind of planning system that actually is effective, that actually works. And to do that, there has to be some investment, but there also has to be some investment in research and knowledge building. Because I want to say this as strongly as I can say it, there is no science, there is no research basis for in-home safety plan. It's not that there couldn't be, it's that there just hasn't been. The scholarly community has not been interested in that particular subject, and child welfare agencies around the country have not invested in it. But now we're in a situation where we do need to invest in it, and immediately, and we need to study it too, right? So in the meantime, I think we have to depend partly on common sense, partly on practice wisdom. And so that's why I come back to a sort of a focusing on a whole range of services that have the potential, at least, to have an immediate safety effect. And so that's why I focus on crisis nurseries, on therapeutic childcare, on residential treatment programs for substance abusing parents and their children. So on the use of foster parents to support a birth parent in terms of respite care and so forth. So those kind of actions that at least have the potential to have an immediate kind of safety effect kind of thing there. So in the meantime, I guess the other thing I want to say, and this is a really, I know this sounds dour, but I just have to say this, currently, there is no good, sound, rational basis for in-home safety planning for endangered kids, not for any kid in the 0 to 2-year-old age range, but for endangered kids in that age range. The idea that we are going to protect endangered kids in that age range with an in-home safety plan, there's no rational basis for that. There's no basis in research. There's no basis in practice experience. Come on. Now, for the somewhat older kids, it's different because with the older kids, even if you have a failure, sometimes it doesn't mean that the kid loses their life here. But for the kids in the 0 to 3-year-old age range, so just remember one stat here, 80% of all the kids who die in child maltreatment fatalities are in the 0 to 3-year-old age range. So that's why issues around foster care rates for kids in the 4 to 17-year-old age range, they don't affect child maltreatment deaths at all, like zero. But for kids in the 0 to 3-year-old age range, and particularly in the 0 to 1-year-old age range, then the use or lack of use of foster care, that does in fact make a difference, in my view, on child maltreatment, both numbers of deaths and on rates of death. And I think this state has again been the canary in the coal mine for that particular idea. I mean, once again, we've got out in front of the rest of the country and done something that was innovative, praiseworthy, but at the same time risky. And we've seen what happened with it. And of course, the problem, of course, with social policies is that once people sign on to policies, they are incredibly resistant to admitting mistakes. They're incredibly resistant to admitting that they made a mistake, that they made an error. And that includes people who voted for that law and people who developed it and people who supported it. So herein lies the problem here. A lot of people who were behind that law are still behind it 100%. And denying that the law has had any effect on child maltreatment fatalities when it clearly has had an effect. That doesn't mean that the goals of the law were wrong. I think the goals of the law are very praiseworthy. Let's do less foster care if we can do it in a safe way. Yes, that's a good goal. You have to think pragmatically about how to do that. Pragmatically, what is it going to take to make that idea work? So I'm saying here, let's just start off with the idea, huge new investments in family support services of the sort that I've already described and in other ones as well. And then one other thing I want to say just as a final thing here. If you go back and look at that Ombudsman report and you look in the recommendations section over the last decade, there are hundreds of recommendations. Every year, every report has a whole bunch of recommendations. And in fact, this last report, the 2024 report, it lists all these recommendations from past years. And they even made an effort to sort of reduce the number of actionable things that had been recommended to over 50, which is quite an achievement because there have been hundreds of recommendations, right? Child welfare systems cannot implement hundreds of things. Child welfare systems cannot implement 50 things within a 2-year period of time. That is impossible to do. So one of the problems in trying to reduce the number of child maltreatment deaths is the idea that more is kind of better in terms of recommendation. The more stuff we're doing, particularly stuff related to training, everyone's idea about how you change something for the better, and particularly with child maltreatment deaths, is you just provide people with a lot more training, like training on substance abuse or training on sleep or on unsafe sleep or accidental ingestion of drugs. I guess what I'm saying, after studying this subject for a long, long time, well over several decades, I think training initiatives have very, very little effect on practice outcomes at all. I mean, I think it's necessary to do training. I mean, that's why I'm doing it now for all of you. But I don't think training in and of itself for child welfare staff has any effect on outcomes. You have to do something that is related to practice. So a lot of the OFCO, the Ombudsman's Office recommendations, are in the training category. You need to focus on a few recommendations in the practice category. What are we going to do that is going to change the way people practice immediately with families? And so I've already mentioned some of the resources there, but there are also some other things that can be done there. So for example, the most obvious one to me is that since we're most concerned about kids in the 0 to 3-year-old age range, and particularly in large counties like in King County or in Pierce County or in Thurston County or in Spokane County, child welfare offices should have an infant toddler unit. They should take some of their most experienced staff, the people they have the most confidence in, and specialize in the kids who are most at risk for child maltreatment death and for serious injury as well, right? So start off with getting a bunch of people who have just a lot more expertise and a lot more experience, and put them in contact with the most vulnerable kids, and do that in a systematic kind of a way. Now, the Ombudsman's Office does have some, in their report, they have some good recommendations about putting substance abuse treatment and assessment specialists in every large office. That is something we did in the early 2000s. When there were budget cuts in subsequent years, the legislature came back and they took all that money away. The state needs to go back and do that. There's also a recommendation in there for putting at least a DV consulting kind of person, at least one in every region. So the idea of, how do we get more expertise into these systems? And expertise in substance abuse, in mental health, and domestic violence at the very least. And lastly, the report, to its credit, points out the poverty connection. A lot of the kids who died in these sleep-related unsafe sleep things were living one bedroom, one bed, sibling group sleeping together. That's as much social neglect as it is parental neglect. So to the credit of the child welfare system in this state, there had been gradually a movement toward thinking about giving families more poverty-related kind of services. And particularly, there's a new exciting kind of housing program in this state that is slow to get off the ground, but at least it's there and people are thinking in the overall right direction. So the idea that I have here, and one last idea here, so more than half of the kids who come into foster care in this state come from dirt poor families. That is, not from poor families, from families who are severely poor by federal, less than half of the annual income of the federal poverty standard. In my view, there ought to be support of a few $100s a month in income support for those families, as long as there is an open child welfare case. So just have the goal of knocking out severe poverty, not all poverty, severe poverty, for families with open child welfare cases, and particularly for the ones with very young children, right? Particularly for the ones with very young children. And again, it is not true that that is in some unaffordable kind of pie in the sky idea. That's not true. This state has saved huge amount of money through foster care reductions, right? So, and by the way, in terms of comparison with the expenditures of other states with this, same kind of number of people in the state kind of thing, we aren't on the top end of that nationally. We're sort of in the middle. We aren't breaking the bank with child welfare expenditures. That's just not true. So there's a lot more that can be done there. From the standpoint of services and resources, and also from the supporting more expertise and practice. I think with that, I'll stop. And then I think, Ryan, you have sent out the report, right? You've sent people the report, and so I think we're going to come back. I mentioned come back maybe next month and talk a little bit more about issues related to services for the very youngest group of children, particularly for the infants and toddlers, for the kids in the 0 to 3-year-old age range, right? Where again, 80% of the child maltreatment deaths are happening there. So I think I'll stop.
That sounds great, Dee. And thank you so much for continuing this, and look forward to seeing you again next month. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, bye-bye.